So, in the very first episode of our series, we are very delighted and honored to have Dr. Chris Irons with us. Thank you for being here. If I may say a couple of words about you first.
Sure.
So, Dr. Chris Irons is a clinical psychologist with many, many years of experience in the NHS. He's also the co-director of Balanced Minds, an organization in the UK that is specializing in compassion-focused approaches to psychological distress and difficulties. He has worked closely with Professor Gilbert, the founder of Compassion-Focused Therapy, CFT, and I may say that you have contributed significantly to the field of compassion in general, but also compassion-focused therapy, both clinically and in the research of it as well. Dr. Chris Irons is one of the leading experts, trainers, and supervisors in CFT. Has authored numerous articles, but also books about compassion and compassion-focused therapy. To mention some, he's the author of the Compassionate Mind Approach to Difficult Emotions, co-author of the Compassionate Mind Workbook, and experiencing compassion-focused therapy from the inside out, which I have to say is one of my personal favorites also. And he has also contributed to another important book by Paul Gilbert and Grigoris Simos, which we have here with us, with a chapter about difficult emotions as well. He's also one of the co-developers of the Self-Compassion app. I guess we can also talk a bit about it later as a new project.
Sure.
That's quite interesting. Based on compassion-focused therapy, probably the first app that is focused on that. Yeah. It's fair to say that you have played a significant role in the advancement of compassion-focused therapy, and it is indeed a very big pleasure and honor to have you with us here. You're our first guest, our first speaker in this series. So we will be here to talk about compassion, what it is or what it's not, how we can define it, how and why it matters, and based on the evidence that there is, because there's a big body of research now that is focusing on why it is important, and how we can cultivate it, how we can cultivate our compassionate mind, as you say in CFT, and how it could be meaningful for both our therapeutical process, but also for our personal growth. So we could probably start with getting to know a bit about you and your work.
Sure.
And how you came to work on compassion and with compassion. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, well, thank you first off for inviting me, and it's a real privilege to be the first person on this series. So no, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. And yeah, I guess in starting off the process, I guess it's interesting for me personally how I got into compassion. There's a kind of distant version, which is a lot of my family were all in helping roles, teachers and social workers and people just trying to help other people. So I guess I was raised with that mentality that it's important to care for others and to try to be in jobs or professions that can support people. And so without maybe knowing it, that was already nudging me in that direction. And then I guess the next stepping stone was out of just serendipity. It was out of being encouraged to apply for a job when I was doing my undergraduate psychology degree. And this job happened to be with Paul Gilbert. And so I was, 20 years old, 19 years old, and first met Paul. And it was just transformational that here was somebody who was doing this amazing research on the human mind, psychological distress, on suffering, attachment theory, shame, self-criticism, the sort of early stuff on compassion and caring. And for me, it was just this most amazing experience because it stitched together the slightly detached theoretical stuff I was learning at university that was kind of interesting, but didn't really have a real applied aspect to it. And then I went to work with Paul, and we would be going to take some of his ideas, and we'd go and speak to people with severe mental health problems, and we'd be doing interviews and questionnaires and assessments with them. And then I'd have to take that information back and start looking at it on the computer and start doing statistics. And all of it just came together. And suddenly I was like, this all makes sense to me. And it just happened to be that it was at that time that Paul was really beginning to publish and start to write on his ideas around compassion. So some of this is a complete serendipity. It was just right time, right place. But I do think there's like a backstory to it in which I was primed to want to think about, research, work on, and help this idea of compassion, because I guess as we'll come back later and talk about, at the heart of compassion is this sense of caring. I mean, it comes from our evolved capacity as a mammal to care for others. And so this is an ancient motivation. And so in that sense, I guess I found the right person and the right place and then the right idea in compassion-focused therapy to, really kind of focus my life on and my work on.
And it's fair to say that you were there from the start, when the idea was developing, and started to explore what theoretically made sense, but also how it in research it actually.
Yeah, exactly. It's really interesting looking at Paul Gilbert's work, that he had been researching and publishing stuff for, decades before that. But it was in this process or around that time that Paul started to specifically name compassion more and develop more ideas around that. And Paul and I published a paper in 2004 looking at compassion-focused imagery. So we had a group of people with chronic depression and who are highly self-critical. And so we started trying out some of the ideas and some of the compassionate imagery exercises with this group of clients. So it was that early bit of sort of seeing, and it was an amazing experience really, of seeing Paul with all of these amazing ideas that he'd been developing over many, many, many years and beginning to cultivate them and bring them together in a particular way. And he had been doing that anyway, but it was sort of all moving towards this idea that ultimately came to be compassion-focused therapy. And really amazing just to see him start testing out bits of it. And I guess the bit that was a real pleasure for me was, sort of testing out the real process stuff. So looking at, attachment theory, shame, self-criticism, some of the early measures that we developed on self-criticism and self-reassurance and this type of stuff, and beginning to really get into the guts of how does this work? How is this associated with psychological suffering and distress? And then also this aspect, I guess, of, what's it like if you take people who are very, very self-critical and find self-reassurance and self-compassion really, really difficult and alien? What happens if you start asking them to practice compassionate imagery? Do they like it? Can they do it? Does it help them? And so that kind of bit as well, where you can go from here's an understanding of the theory and then moving it into let's see what we can do and moving backwards and forwards. And I really love that aspect because it really felt like you're learning directly and you're testing out things directly and then learning from it and adapting things and going backwards and forwards. So it was a very, I was very, very lucky, very privileged to be there and witnessing some of the early stages of the development of CFT.
Yeah, and it sounds exciting, but I also see the excitement on your face describing it. So I really understand how it came to be something that you would like to focus on. And you said that by now it's compassion is connected and it has been well researched in relation to many aspects of psychology and other constructs. But before we go to that, because I think that's also quite important to say what we now know about the evidence in compassion, should we focus on what it is? How can we explain it in easy words, but also using the hard science that is behind it now that we know? Like, what is compassion?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rupi. And I think one of the difficulties is to go from a lot of the work that we do and how we would see it and how we define it and some of the deep theory that goes into CFT and the understanding of compassion. The reality of actually speaking to people about it and how on a sort of lay level people understand what compassion is and what it isn't is really fascinating. I mean, it's sometimes if you ask people, what do you make of this word compassion? people do very quickly go to some positive connotations. So they'll say things like, I don't know, if it was like a synonym of compassion, if you were to look in a thesaurus and what are the associated words, people will say things like empathy, kindness, care, patience, warmth, so they'll list a whole bunch of really positively skewed words. But certainly when I'm working with many of my clients, but I would say just for a lot of the general population, actually just underneath those positive words, maybe just underneath the surface of it, there are actually some negative connotations. So it's quite important sometimes to ask people that directly. I know that you were just mentioning there's all these positive associations you have with it, but do you have any negative beliefs about compassion? Or do you have any concerns about the idea of self-compassion? And it is amazing. Very quickly, people will say, oh, actually, now you mention it, yes, I think it's a bit weak. I think it's a bit wishy-washy. I think it's a bit selfish or narcissistic, or it would involve letting people off the hook, or it would involve me not trying so hard, or making more mistakes. So I always find it fascinating that in terms of English words, there's very few that I'm aware of that have such a dimensional stretch from, at one end, these amazingly positive connotations, but actually at the other end, some really quite negative connotations. So I think the first thing to say is that compassion is a tricky word for many, many people. And that's why it's really important for us to kind of be aware of that and to ask people about that, and not to be put off when people do come with negative connotations. That's fine. But it's almost like a window in to be able to say, would it be okay if I shared with you what we think compassion is, or how we see it? It's fair to say, I don't know about you, but for me, if I thought that compassion was selfish, weak, letting people off the hook, and would make me make more mistakes, why would I spend time in a therapy called compassion-focused therapy? I mean, I wouldn't do it. So I sometimes, have a laugh with my clients about, I agree with them. I wouldn't do it if that was what it actually
Makes
was.
sense.
But then it opens up, would it be okay then if I share with you how we see it? And so I guess we have a definition. And so the definition is that compassion is a sensitivity to the suffering of self and others, with a commitment to relieve that suffering and try to prevent it returning. And I guess within that definition, because that definition, of course, definitions are quite word heavy a lot of the time. For us, it's that it holds these two parts. So the first part is about, can we find ways to become more sensitive to be able to notice, move towards and engage with distress and suffering, whether it's in you, Merope, or whether it's in me. So it's very hard to do something helpful about suffering if you don't notice it. If I cut my finger and it's bleeding really badly, if I notice it, I can do something about it. If I don't notice it's bleeding, then actually that can cause big problems. So the first thing, can I notice, engage with, and sort of understand something about it? And then the second part, which is associated but also really important, is to take wise action. Again, so I could cut my finger and it could be bleeding. If I don't have an idea about what to do with a bleeding finger, then I might do something that's unhelpful for it. So it's this whole idea that you have wise action. And that could be for you. How can I take wise action to try to alleviate your shame, your distress, your anxiety? Or it could be for me, how do I tune in and begin to look at myself and find wise ways of helping myself? So these two psychologies, we call them the two psychologies of compassion, become really important for us in understanding compassion. But even then, these are still just definitions. They're still just words. So what we normally then try to do, if I was working clinically with people or just telling anybody about compassion, is to try to put examples to this, to try to bring it into the real world. And there's lots of different ways you can do that, but normally it's trying to ask people to think about situations that they can answer the question. For example, if your friend was really, really unwell, they're really sick and they're stuck in bed for the last 2 weeks, and you've just found out that they have heard from their doctor that they need to go to hospital because they're really unwell, but they're scared of hospitals. They won't go. You could then sort of ask the question, so what would you do? What would compassion look like to your friends? And I guess what you're trying to do there is to get people to think about, because they care about this person, what are the steps that they might take? And normally when you ask that, most people go to the second part of compassion. So they say, I'd go around and I would support them to go to hospital. Or maybe I'd phone the hospital and get the doctor to come, so they do the problem solving bit. And that's great. But it also gives an opportunity to ask people, but how would you go about doing that? How would you show your friend that you understand them first? And I guess maybe for many of us, I don't know about you, but certainly for me and maybe many people watching this, if you have a problem, just like something that's stressing you out, and you tell it to your partner or to a friend, if you imagine immediately your partner says, well, I know what I do. So the way that you solve this is you need to do this and this. How does that make you feel?
Yeah, doesn't sound that caring.
Yeah, I mean, it's great that they've got ideas, but most of us find that a bit invalidating when somebody jumps straight to the doing bit. So then, of course, you can slow down and say, well, what do you need first? Before somebody might make suggestions about what's helpful. And most of us would say, I want to feel like they've listened. And then you can have, well, how would they show that? I like to feel that they understood me, or they validated me, or have empathy for me. Okay, so how would they do that? So most of us have a sense that actually, whilst the second part of compassion is important, actually without the first part, without feeling like somebody's understood you and seen you and tuned into you, it can feel invalidating, or it can feel a bit distant.
Yeah. I think the connection of being aware and being open to someone's feelings and then taking the wise action, I think is really important, because, like you said, many people either do one or the other.
Yes.
Often. And especially people who come to see us in therapy may have these beliefs about what is empathy and how one should be helped. And I think that's a frequent phenomenon, is that they actually come and want relief through solutions.
Exactly.
But when we come to discuss, I'm not going to give you straight solutions.
Yes.
I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm here to listen. They finally realize, it's like an aha moment of,
yes,
that feels nice, that actually I'm being heard and understood.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Although I think for some people it's really frustrating to start with. It's like, what do you mean you're here to listen? Like, I just want you to tell me what to do.
Me what to do.
It's like, understandably so, like people want a type of psychological Valium that they want almost like a pill, but in a psychological form. Yeah. Like, teach me something that will get rid of this anxiety, or teach me something that will help me to feel better. And I completely get that. But it's very hard to know what to do to help somebody if we first don't fully understand, and they find it very hard to tune into their own distress, crucially to be able to tolerate their own distress, to be on the presence of it and not get overwhelmed, and to be able to have this sort of empathy and understanding about it. So these stepping stones, although I think sometimes are frustrating for people, I think you're absolutely right to recognize that with these two psychologies, you often see that just generally in people, but certainly when people come to see me, that people can kind of do one of them-ish and not the other. Sometimes I do have it where people are blocked to both of them. But it's almost like you can see with this definition when people come in to see you at first, which one are you able to do? Are you able to do this bit? And so I'm not talking to people necessarily about the definition at this stage, but in my mind, I can start to see it mapped out, and I can start to see where might I have to start helping people. And then we can go into more in my head. We've got different parts to the first psychology, which can help us, different components of that, which we can tone up and train up a bit like different muscles in the body. We can go to the gym and work them out. And then for the second psychology, the alleviation part, the taking wise action, again, there are different things that we can do to try to help people, different skills training that we can do. But I think coming back to your original question, all of this in a way has a really, for us, important sort of theoretical and evolutionary backdrop, which is that this idea of compassion is rooted originally in this mammalian caregiving system. So it's estimated that the first mammal turned up on this planet 225 million years ago. And over millions and millions of years, mammals cultivated this very powerful motive, which was to care for others, originally their offspring, and to put in a lot of energy, a lot of focus, a lot of attention into the needs of their offspring, what they need to do to be able to help those needs. And that motivation, how much energy mammals put into looking after, caring for, feeding, protecting, teaching and shaping their offspring is really the bedrock of all of this. And the important thing about that, I guess, is that to do that, you have to have changes in your brain that allow you to be sensitive and notice the distress and the needs of another, but also to have some sort of ideas of how to fulfill those needs. But interestingly, in the offspring, in the baby, there also has to be a brain in which can send out signals to the parent to say, I need you, I need something. And also when you get that thing, for that distress call to switch off. So there needs to also be a brain, and I guess an associated physiology that can send signals of need, but also be responsive to signals. And of course, there you have the early origins of, I guess, from a psychological point of view, attachment theory and Bowlby's work and so on. You can begin to see this beginning to play out of how you've got two brains and bodies that have co-evolved to be able to send signals to each other and to be able to be responsive in the face of needs. So that's like the big backdrop. And what makes it different, why compassion isn't just the same as caring, is that we have this evolved brain in which we can think and imagine and ruminate and perspective take and mentalize. So we have this evolved brain in which we can take this caring motive and then we can add on to it this sort of knowing awareness. So it's not just that I care for you. I can now imagine, how might Merope be feeling because she told me about this issue she's been having at work. Let me see if I can use my imagination, my empathy to reach in and imagine what would that be like, particularly because she's also told me in the past, this thing happened or this thing happened. And so for us, it's this combination of this ancient caring motive added on to our human ability to be able to think, mentalize, empathize, and so on. And if you mix those two things together, that's what ultimately leads to this thing called compassion.
Yeah. So it's kind of the result of the old and new brain working together.
Yeah, exactly. And so in that, sort of Hoyeristic way in CFT, we would talk about how we do share this very old brain, which has basic motives like to care for and the desire to reproduce and to compete, like many other animals, have the same thing. And, a set of behavioral responses, fight, flight, and submission. Again, you see this in any of those TV shows of Attenborough's shows where you see animals. And of course, some basic emotions. So you have all this stuff which we share so much of it with other animals walking this earth, but having also this relatively recent new brain, probably the last million years or so that this has developed. And out of this new brain comes these new psychologies, these new abilities to be able to think, self-reflect, to mentalize, to perspective take in really amazing and creative ways. And so you're absolutely right. It's this combination of these two things that gives rise to human compassion in the way that we talk about it. And ultimately, of course, that is for you, but it also means that I can do that for me. So I can treat me as an object. And so I can notice my own distress. I can understand something about it. I can try and tolerate it. And then I can also start taking steps to think about how do I work with my own distress. And that's the bit, of course, in which, as far as we know, no other animal can do that. And so the intriguing thing, I guess, from a CFT and an evolutionary point of view is, what is our self-to-self relationship? And I guess it's something which, has always fascinated me. If you add every single hour you spend in relationship with other people in your life, so your parents, your siblings, your friends at school, your partner, your work colleagues, if you add up all of those hours and add them together, it comes nowhere close to how many hours you spend in relationship with yourself. But I think the big thing there is, what relationship do you have with you? Do you treat yourself with the same care, the same kindness, the same empathy as you treat the people that you love the most on this planet? Most people, it's a no. And for some people, tragically, it's not just that they don't treat themselves with the same kindness, the same care, the same empathy, is that actually they treat themselves in a really hostile, punitive, condemning, critical kind of way. And this is this really awful aspect, I guess, about being human as well, about having a brain that can think and self-reflect, in that we can begin to actually internalize and look at ourselves in ways that most of us would never talk to another person, that we would never think and feel and treat another person in the same way, but we can absolutely do that for ourselves. So this whole idea in CFT, where it's the model started, I guess, out of self-criticism and shame, and just how potent those are in such a painful way for many people that we work with, and how we can try to shift people from this shame-based, self-critical way of being with themselves to a more compassionate, caring, understanding way of being.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand how we can be really harsh with ourselves. But I also remember Paul Gilbert's comment. I think it was probably on one of your work on balanced minds, saying that the human species have the capacity to be really harsh to others, but also to themselves. But we also have an extraordinary capacity to be kind and really face struggles and pain head on and do something about it. So I think it's important that we can also see the other side, that we can actually change this. And you've done a lot of work on how compassion is related to, but also is really important in dealing with self-criticism, with shame. So talking about this, would you like to tell us a bit more about what the research shows about that? Like, how is it connected? That what can it actually do about those things, about those struggles?
It's a really great question. And I guess, well, there's two bits actually to pick up on there. The first bit was this whole thing that for us, if you want to understand compassion, it's also really important to understand what inhibits compassion, what switches it off. How is it that humans can be so callous and so cruel? And of course, tragically, we see around the world at the moment awful cruelty happening and indifference to the suffering of children, for example, in various war zones across the world. It's tragic. And so from a CFT point of view, it's really important. How does that happen? How is it that we can be the most caring, the most compassionate species, but at the same time that we can see such distress, such suffering, and that we can be relatively cut off? And it's really interesting, I guess, just being here in Thessaloniki, of also recognizing, just trying to do a bit of reading about the history, and just recognizing, I guess, how many times this city was invaded, how many times the city was taken over, how many wars were fought over it and around it over the centuries, and just to recognize that this is part of the human psyche in many ways, and that there is something very territorial and something very potentially cruel and aggressive and harmful, and that for us opening up to that and recognizing that that can be the case, whether it is on a national level or between groups, or whether it is within relationships between you and your partner, or you and your parents, or of course internally, whether it's with you and you. And so I guess that leads then to this idea that CFT is not just a self-compassion therapy, although I'll come on just to say about the shame bit in a moment, but CFT is a compassion-focused therapy. And in that sense, we talk about the three flows of compassion. So I see you distressed and I want to try and alleviate it. So the flow is from me to you. There's a second flow, which is when I'm distressed and I'm suffering. Can I seek you out and then receive your compassion? And it turns out that's actually a very difficult thing for many people, but for many people that we work with. And then the third version, of course, is self-compassion. Can I notice my own distress, and can I be sensitive and responsive to it? And so coming back to your original question about shame and self-criticism, one of the bits that I think has been really interesting in terms of CFT is that we're interested on multiple levels of understanding this process. And so like other therapies, we have tried to do outcome studies in which we can try to show if you take a course of compassionate mind training. So that's not so much the therapy, but just taking people through compassion exercises, some of the psychoeducation, some of the practices. So it's not therapy, it's just the psychoed and the practices. What happens to people's levels of shame and self-criticism? And the same as well for compassion-focused therapy. So 10 weeks, 14 weeks, 20 weeks, what happens from the start of therapy with levels of shame and self-criticism? What happens to to those in the end? And the studies are great. They're showing that there are significant reductions in shame and self-criticism. We can begin to track those, week by week. We can see how that changes at times because there's been an increase in levels of compassion. It's a bit of a cliche, but often people talk about how compassion is an antidote to shame. So this whole sort of idea in a way that there's something about compassion that can shift people out of this shame-based self-critical mind into something else. So it's been really important that we can look at those studies, but we've also been interested, of course, in trying to understand the process, how is shame and self-criticism associated with compassion, for example? If we just look at correlational studies, how can we look at people's early life experiences and see if you experience lots of warmth and emotional support, how is that associated with the subsequent development of something like self-compassion or compassion for others, or maybe lower levels of self-criticism? And then the other way around, tragically, of course, that if you've experienced lots of abuse, if you've experienced lots of rejection and so on, Paul and I did a number of these studies many years ago now to see how that's associated with higher levels of shame, higher levels of self-criticism, and actually lower levels, significantly lower levels of things like self-compassion. And actually something really important, which has been a big focus of CFT, the fears of compassion, and how actually many people understandably find this a very difficult experience. So we've been looking at those kind of studies and really trying to unpick and understand, first of all, what could facilitate or inhibit the development of shame, self-criticism, and also compassion. How these different ideas are associated with each other, so we can begin to see what's their relationship with each other, how can we see the link between them. So those sort of studies have been really useful. But then there's a third set of studies which I think are really, really fascinating, which are, if we look inside you, if we look inside your brain through a brain scan, if we look inside you in terms of your physiology, can we see how shame and self-criticism affects your brain? Which parts of the brain does it tend to light up, and how does it affect your autonomic nervous system? And then can we see what happens when you start to practice compassion? Do we see a change in that? And so James Kirby and some of his colleagues in Australia have done some wonderful studies on this, in which they ask people to come into the lab. You go into a brain scanner and you are asked to think about something that's triggered your threat system, that you've been rejected by somebody recently, or that you've had a failure in your work. So you have to think about something that's a bit stressful, that's unpleasant. And then they ask people to do two things. First of all, criticize yourself for that failure or for that rejection. And so they're scanning your brain as that's happening, and they're noticing the areas that begin to light up more as you're doing that. And then people are taken through a short compassion exercise, one of the major ones that we use in CFT, and then they're asked to bring compassion to that same problem. So it's really crucial here that you're asked to focus on the same one thing. So you could either focus on this from a critical point of view, or you could try to focus it from a compassionate point of view, but it's still something which is tricky, something that's stressful. And the fascinating bit of being able to see the difference there, whether it's physiologically what happens in your body in terms of changes in your activation of your parasympathetic nervous system, your vagal nerve, but also in terms of the brain, being able to show, for example, a significant reduction in the firing of the amygdala when you are practicing compassion to this thing that was stressful. So what I really appreciate about the sort of range of studies that we've been trying to look at CFT is that they go across multiple levels, and that it's really important that we can also show inside us. It's not just something nice that we're doing. I mean, it might be nice sometimes when you practice compassion. It's not about it being nice or even feeling good at times, but more about this whole thing, actually what changes physiologically inside of you. And actually many, many years ago, CFT used to be known as a type of neurophysiotherapy, because Paul was always very interested in how do we target physiological processes. And so I think a lot of the CFT research, you'll see that playing out, in that we are very interested in seeing, actually, when you practice this stuff, it changes your body, it changes your mind. And in fact, we've got a wonderful CFT researcher and colleague, Marcelo Matos, who's looking at this on a genetic level and showing that when you practice compassion exercises, how this can bring epigenetic change. So it literally is changing aspects of how your genes are working. So really exciting and fascinating, I think, research which is being produced by the community.
Yeah, it does sound exciting. I really agree on that, and I feel like it's important to see, like to see it with hard proof,
Yes.
I'd say with hard evidence, that it doesn't just feel good, but it
Yes.
actually works, and you can see it in the actual brain.
Such an important point, because the feeling good bit, a lot of people feel that compassion should feel good, whereas actually one of the big distinguishers for us is that compassion is not an emotion. Because if you think that compassion is an emotion, often you think it is an emotion which is linked to feeling good, positive, warmth, love, kindness, care, and sometimes compassion is associated with those things. But I guess the really important bit is that because it's not an emotion, the emotions that sometimes come with compassion can vary massively. So we use examples, for example, of if there was a burning building and a firefighter is going in to save a young child, we could argue that that's a compassionate action. The firefighter is sensitive to the child who's in distress, who's suffering, and they are taking wise action to try to relieve that suffering. So it's the two parts of compassion that we were talking about before. But how likely is it that the firefighter is about to enter this burning building and they're full of happiness and joy and warmth and love? I don't think so. And if you speak to any firefighters, that's not how they're feeling.
Yeah.
And so actually for many firefighters, they might be feeling anxious. At times they might feel scared. So the bit there is that actually sometimes compassion actually needs to take us into distress and suffering, but it's how we're going in to distress and suffering, that we're going in with courage, that we've cultivated qualities that can help us to do that. And so ultimately in the end, at times compassion might end up feeling nice and good, but almost the first bit is recognizing that what we're more bothered about is the motive, being sensitive to suffering. How can you be in the presence of it? How can you have courage and stability in the face of it? And then how can you take wise action? And a recognition that sometimes compassion will be hard, very, very hard. And sometimes it will feel painful to engage in your own distress. But that's okay. That's all right, because you don't need to feel positive emotions to be compassionate with yourself. And in fact, we often say to start with, actually just leave the emotional bit beside. That will come maybe in time. But the first bit is, how do we help you to begin to become more aware of, more able to engage in your own distress, and then begin to take actions, wise actions. And if we can begin to do that thing, maybe over time, some of those other positive emotions will come, but we don't have to start with that. And compassion doesn't require that as a starting point for its work.
Yeah. I think that's one of the really popular myths about compassion. It's like people think it's an emotion, and it has to be like a warm, fuzzy one.
Yes, exactly.
That feels nice. And, I think it's also one of the reasons why it's related to people not wanting or being hesitant to actually approach compassion. You mentioned the fear of compassion. So I wonder what we know from research now about this aspect of fear of compassion.
Yeah.
And also fear of self-compassion. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's something that we end up saying in CFT, that it is the work. So the fear of compassion. So actually we talk about what facilitates compassion, what makes it hard. And then we have this sort of term, the fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion. So shorthand, we call them FBRs. And so it is a really central part to compassion, because actually the reality is compassion is really, really difficult for many people. And so understanding why it's difficult, understandably so, is almost like a crucial stepping stone to then doing something about it. And I guess we kind of, we would know this in any other profession, I guess. If you're a doctor, you first try to understand what the ailment is before you start doing something helpful. So for us, understanding this idea that people find compassion difficult, they can be scared of it and blocked, and there are really good reasons for this, is really then helpful to be able to support the person in understanding this is the case, but also as a clinician, so that you can tolerate at first people finding this difficult. And I guess an analogy would be sometimes that we use that if you were as a clinician, if you were doing exposure work with somebody, let's say it was somebody who was very anxious, maybe agoraphobic, and they hadn't left their apartment for 6 months. And so you were doing some sort of hierarchical exposure work with them. And let's say one of the early steps was to ask them to open the front door of their apartment to take a step out onto the balcony, for example. First up, I guess, is that if your client started to get anxious, as a clinician, would you be shocked or surprised? Well, no.
Not really, yeah.
Because you kind of expect it. If they have a problem with anxiety and it's to do with agoraphobia and leaving their apartment, you expect to see, as you start to do exposure work, that the person gets anxious. In fact, if your client doesn't get anxious, actually that's the concerning bit, because probably they didn't have agoraphobia in the first place. It's something else. So you expect it with something like an anxiety disorder, with a phobia of snakes or spiders or dogs. You expect people to get anxious as you start exposing them to this thing. And so as a clinician, you don't get anxious or panicky or think, oh my God, I'm doing something wrong here. You expect it. Whereas what we would say is it's the same for compassion. And so there was a questionnaire that was developed in 2011 by Paul Gilbert and some of his colleagues called the Fear of Compassion Scale. And I often say to my clients, if they are struggling with the fear of compassion, that something is common in life when a psychologist has developed a questionnaire to measure that thing. And the fact that there is a questionnaire tells you that there are many, many, many people in the world who find this really difficult. It's not just you, this common humanity bit. But the interesting bit, I guess, about the fact that they developed this questionnaire was to try to capture what are some of the common difficulties with compassion. And so the questionnaire actually has 3 subscales: the fear of compassion from me to you. So, for example, this might well be that if I'm more compassionate to you, Marupi, that you might take advantage of me. So this idea that actually I become somehow weak, or I become a bit more vulnerable by opening up and try to be helpful to you. There's the fears of compassion from others. So this might be that I fear you giving me compassion because it's not genuine. Or that you might give it to me today, but tomorrow when I look for help, you won't be there for me. So I can't trust that it's going to be consistent. And then, of course, the fear of self-compassion. And we've touched on some of those things that will make me weak, that I'll be overcome with sadness. And so this questionnaire is really interesting because when you look at this, people who score higher on these flows of compassion, these fears of compassion, also have significantly higher levels of self-criticism, of shame, anxiety, depression. They have significantly lower well-being. And so what we begin to recognize there is that because this is a correlation, you can flip it on its head, which is people who have higher levels of shame, self-criticism, depression, and anxiety, which pretty much everyone that I've ever worked with clinically are likely to have significantly higher levels of the fears of compassion. So for us, it almost just becomes this is the work, and we look out for it all the time. And we have then various things that we can do to help people to begin to understand this, and to, I guess, sort of help people to recognize that it's okay if they find this hard to start with. It's all right. Just like you might find it hard if you hadn't done any physical exercise for a year and you go for a personal training session down at the gym, you kind of expect it to be hard. Yeah. You expect to get out of breath. You expect your muscles to be in pain. If you didn't know that, though, that would be really scary. If you go down to a session and you begin to get a shortness of breath and your muscles start hurting, that would be really scary if you have no idea why that's happening. And of course you'd want to pull away. Of course you would think that this is wrong for me. Of course you would think this is a really unhealthy thing. Whereas if you understand that getting fit involves getting out of breath, it involves your muscles sometimes hurting, that actually that is an expected thing and it's okay. It might not feel pleasant still, but at least I don't have that secondary bit that there must be something wrong about this. And so for us and for clinicians being able to use CFT, it's really important that we understand about the fears of compassion, how we can share those ideas with the people that we're working with, and how ultimately we can be confident, because all the studies show it, that you tend to get a significant reduction in the fears of compassion after you start doing CFT work, which I think is is reassuring.
Yeah, reassuring. And like you said, I think it's quite normalizing the experience of distress, to know that this is something that, if it's unknown, it could be frightening.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. You mentioned self-criticism, you mentioned shame. I guess that from our experience, we can also think of clients with highly self-critical parts that we have to work with in therapy. But there's really interesting research about trauma and how it relates also with compassion and self-compassion. And you mentioned earlier attachment, and we now know for various aspects of psychopathology or the distress in general, not just disorders, how early life experiences can be quite important and impactful. So would you like to tell us a bit about how trauma and or distressing early life experiences are related to compassion and self-compassion, and what we now know from research about this?
Yeah, one of the nice bits, I guess, about CFT is that it's a highly integrated approach and that it draws from many other sciences. And one of the big influences of CFT is developmental psychology, but in particular attachment theory. And Bowlby's amazing work, and I guess Bowlby's ideas, attachment theory is an evolutionary psychology approach. It's about the mammalian attachment system and how this evolved to regulate distress between initially sort of parents and offspring. And so the interesting bit, of course, with Bowlby's work and then Mary Ainsworth's work on the different types of attachment styles and all the wonderful work that's happened over the years in the attachment theory domain, is that very much this links to and can be integrated very clearly into guiding CFT work, and very much has been integrated into it. Because you can begin to see that if you are lucky enough to be raised with caregivers, with parents who are available, so when you need them, you can seek them out and they are there. And not only are they there, but when they see that you're distressed, they're responsive. And so they might pick you up. They might have a certain type of voice tone and facial expression. So maybe if I give an example to this, my son Idris is 6 years old, and let's say that I was at a soft play thing with him this weekend, and his big thing at the moment, he's absolutely obsessed with his football, and the biggest obsession within football is Leo Messi, the Argentinian football player. And so let's say that my son has found a football with Messi's face on it, or it's, you know, the Messi ball or whatever. And he's at this soft play and he's kicking it around and he's absolutely delighted. He's trying to recreate Messi's goals and having a great time. And then if you imagine like a bigger kid who's like 11 comes up and takes the ball away from my son and walks off. What's my son going to do? Well, he's 6 and he's going to get upset and he's going to start crying. And I guess from a Bowlby point of view, at that point, you can begin to see attachment dynamics playing out. So the first thing upon getting distressed, Bowlby suggests, is that my son would start to proximity seek. So he'll look around the room and try and find me and run up to me. So that would be the first bit. Second bit is, what do I do? What would you hope that I would do upon my son doing this? Well, I guess in that sense, Bowlby would talk about that I become a safe haven. So I would pick him up. I would hold him in my arms. My facial expression, my voice tone would all be trying to soothe some of his distress. I'd be trying to validate him, what's just happened. I would try to explain or use language in a way to reassure him. And so that aspect of me doing this as an external other would start to calm his distress, his threat system in CFT language. So it starts to calm that down. And let's say after a minute or 90 seconds that now my care, my safeness, my validation, my warmth has settled his distress. At that stage, how likely is it that a 6-year-old is going to want to stay in his dad's arm when he's got all these toys and these fun things to do? Well, he's not. And so Bowlby's final bit in that sense was, my son can then go down from me and use me as a secure base. So he can go back out into the world and he can start to investigate and play and have fun again, knowing that if he gets distressed, he can do the same three things. He can seek me out, proximity seek. I can operate as his safe haven, and then he can go back out into the world. And of course, the point about this is that if I did that 1,000 times, 10,000 times through my son's life, from an attachment theory point of view, we would suspect that he would develop a secure attachment style. So he would have this sense of a working model that when distressed, I can go out to the world and other people will be there. They'll be responsive. They'll be helpful. And of course, with Bowlby and Ainsworth's ideas, that gets internalized, that I then have a secure attachment style so I can go inwards and also begin to do that for myself in the absence of, say, you being there for me. So if you can understand that side of things, what's happening psychologically and physiologically is that you are laying the groundwork for compassion, because you've got this secure basis to orientate both to other people, but also to oneself. You can see naturally there is this extension then from a secure attachment style. You've got this flexibility you've witnessed it, you've seen it, and you've internalized it. So we've got some nice studies showing this overlap then between secure attachment styles and higher levels of the flows of compassion. But if it's not like that example that I've just given, let's say that instead of what I just told you about my son, let's say that I'm away for work a lot of the time. So when my son's distressed, I'm not there physically. Or let's say that physically I am there, but I'm so tired because I've just been traveling so much, or I'm overwhelmed with stress, and that when he does seek me out, I'm physically there, but actually I'm just not responsive. I'm on my phone, or I'm just a bit tuned out, or I'm a bit rough with myself. Oh, I'll deal with it later. What starts happening then, of course, for my son is that over time, how much can I trust that my dad's going to be available? How much can I trust that he's responsive? How much can I trust that actually he'll be there encouraging me, helping me going out into the world? And of course, from an attachment theory point of view, different types of more insecure attachment styles are going to naturally start to occur. Not that it's a bad thing, but my son can't just trust that I'm a benign, caring, supportive other, because that's not what he's learned. And so, of course, what happens in the attachment system is that I have to start developing, in a way, other defensive responses, either to be tracking and very sensitive. Where is my dad? How do I work out whether he's going to be caring to me? So I'm having to monitor, if I'm my son looking towards me. Or, of course, he has to begin to downregulate that and think, oh no, aversion, it's not consciously decided. Actually, I need to work out other ways to manage my own distress, because I've learned that other people can't really be trusted and they won't really be there for me. And so if we begin to see that side of things, you can see the link then to how being compassionate to others, receiving compassion to others, being compassionate towards oneself, you're not really laying the foundation stones for that. In fact, what we do know is that you are laying more of the foundation stones, and this is certainly borne out in the research, for things like self-criticism and for things like shame. Because, of course, we've got this evolved brain that we didn't choose to have, but if I do have the sense that if I go to you and you're my mum and I'm distressed and actually you shout at me, or you tell me, just pull yourself together, Chris, or, come on, boys don't cry, you got to be tougher. On one level, you can see that how do I begin to think about myself? Well, it's very hard as a child to think, actually, my mum's not very sensitive. She's not very caring. There's, what's going on for her. You can't think that. There isn't that awareness. And so, as you know, a lot of what happens is people start to internalize. There must be something wrong with me. And which, of course, is a classic aspect then of shame, that there's a sense of inadequacy, that there's something inferior about me. There's something wrong with me. There's something bad with me. And so, of course, you can begin to see how these pathways get plotted out. And that would be the bit that we have done research on this in CFT. One of the exciting bits, there's 2 bits of research that I've been involved with, in which when we take people through compassionate mind training, we can actually see significant reductions in anxious attachment and significant reductions in avoidant attachment. So through relatively short periods of practice, it seems that we can stimulate the attachment system. And I'm not saying that we shift people into a secure attachment style. I don't mean it in a kind of categorical way. But what we can see is that we're taking the edge off, or some of the potency off, the more insecure attachment side of things. And I think that's a very exciting thing, that we can explicitly show that by doing compassion practices and by learning about the model, you are actually affecting the attachment system. It's almost like you're reorientating it in a different way. And so certainly for me, because I did my academic PhD on attachment theory, that's something which I find really interesting, really, really exciting work that we want to do more of in the future as well.
Yeah, that sounds really, really interesting and exciting. And I think it's this is only a part of a bigger wave that is currently evolving in psychotherapy and in research as well. There's been more and more talk about attachment. I mean, it evolved quite early, but it's still a very hot topic because it does affect the way we are and the way we feel and the way we make relationships with others in the here and now. So what you're saying about actually, shifting and changing the attachment style is really, really important, I think.
Yeah.
And it's encouraging, I think, for clinicians to hear this and to see this, that the research is really backing this up.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but, I think that any approach that can begin to show that you're bringing change on a process level. So symptomatic change is brilliant, but I think it's so easy for psychotherapies just to get caught up in, what's the significant reduction in depression symptoms, in flashbacks, in voice hearing, whatever it might well be. I mean, that's important research, but I think it's too easy that we just focus on that and we lose the how, what is the mechanism or what's being changed. And I think it's really important that we can try to look at things, classic processes like attachment style or the attachment system, and begin to see if we start to do these types of things, what happens on that level, because it's this process level stuff, I think, Merope, which is really interesting. How, and you asked before, how does an approach work? How does it bring change? And I think we've spent so many millions of pounds, dollars, euros on doing outcome research in psychotherapy that sometimes we haven't spent, and it might have been more effective to spend a lot of those millions on more process-orientated research. How is psychotherapy affecting these things? And does each psychotherapy affect, say, the attachment system in the same way? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But that type of work, I think, could be really exciting going forward.
Yeah. Is this currently something that is explored in research, or is this like a step in the future? You think the comparative effectiveness on those processes?
I think there's more focus on that these days, which is really exciting. That's cutting across the outcome side of things and looking more at process-orientated research. Whether it's Steve Hayes and some of the work that they've been doing on process work. Obviously, CFT has always been a process-oriented approach, so this is how we've been built upon. But I guess, many of the psychodynamic therapies would be, trying to look at the process-orientated bit as well. So I do think, I don't know if that I could say there's a shift. I hope there is, and that we can have it in conjunction or in parallel alongside symptomatic changes and so on, that we can really look at both this process-orientated bit, but also things like on a physiological epigenetic level as well. Look at these multiple levels of change and begin to work out not so much about there is a therapy that is the best, but just to understand more about what helps people. What can we do more of in therapies, plural, and how can we guide ourselves in understanding some of the things that we could do on a process level that would be really helpful.
Yeah, and perhaps how we can adjust therapy so that it fits every person with individual characteristics better. So that this tailoring of therapy that we talk so much about, I think this also helps, how we can...
I think so. And I guess you're nudging as well to, if you begin to look at what are some of the things that go across presentations. So CFT has always been talked about as a transdiagnostic approach to working with mental health problems. I guess I would argue in some ways that it's not even transdiagnostic. It's not about diagnosis per se, that it's actually just looking at human processes. So you don't need to have a mental health problem to have struggles with the attachment system. You don't have to have a mental health diagnosis to have struggles with self-criticism or shame. So this idea that actually what we're working with are just common human difficulties, and to a certain extent we can leave the diagnostic and the symptomatic aspect. I'm not saying it's not important, but we can leave that to the side, and that actually we focus more on the common human things. What are some of the things that cause human beings pain? And how can we begin to understand those and work with them, and see what happens when you go through therapy or even outside of therapy? If you take people through mindfulness practices, acceptance practices, compassion-based practices like we do in CFT, what happens with some of these processes? What happens to the attachment system? What happens to your self-to-self relating in terms of self-criticism or shame? And so I think that's an area where it does feel like there's more energy and effort going towards. And personally, I think that's, really wonderful.
So it can be something that can be helpful and effective for people regardless of diagnosis or specificity of difficulties.
Yeah, because as you know, I mean, a diagnosis can be helpful as a sort of shorthand, but it can also be massively problematic. And if we're just going on that aspect, there are so many people who are sub-threshold of a diagnosis, but who are absolutely suffering. And so if we look at suffering and distress as the common denominator rather than a diagnosis per se, then I think we're definitely heading in a better direction.
I totally agree with that. So you mentioned a couple of things that are now in the forefront of research in CFT. One of the things that is currently a hot topic is technology and machine learning and AI as well. So I was wondering, with all those new developments in technology and with AI being part of our lives, how do you think it could be, I don't know if it is, what you think, it could be affecting the work on compassion-focused therapy, and how could CFT perhaps be evolving through this aspect? You've been involved in the development of an app, of a self-compassion app. So I'm guessing that you feel about it somehow positively, but I would like to hear what you think about this.
Yeah, I guess it's really interesting about technology, which parts of technology, and I think with technology, it kind of feels like science more broadly, that it can be used in benign, compassionate, supportive ways, or the same technology can be used or affect people in a negative way. And so, I guess the jury's going to be out, because it partly depends on motive. And the sad bit, I guess, the tragic bit is that a lot of technology is purposefully being used to stimulate motives, physiology and emotional parts of us, which can ultimately cause us difficulties. That we know that many of these algorithms on whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Instagram are absolutely designed to play our psychologies and our physiology in ways which actually can be very damaging for us and can actually cause us quite a lot of distress. And so again, I think so much of it starts off with what's the intention, how is something being used? So of course we developed the self-compassion app partly as a way of thinking, well, you can use this alongside your therapy, but could we just take this out and anybody anywhere in the world who's got a smartphone can access this and start to utilize some of the wonderful ideas that Paul developed, some of the wonderful practices of CFT, and potentially benefit from it. And we actually did a research study looking at this with university students and university lecturers, and found that using the app for 28 days led to significant reductions in psychological distress and self-criticism and increases in compassion and so on. So again, this wasn't a therapy population, and this was just people using an app. And it was really important for us to do that, because I think it's far too easy with some of the health apps that they are promoted as being helpful, but often you never see any published research looking at this. It's just they're marketed as helpful things. And maybe they are, but we don't know. So for us, it was really important, and we're going to continue to do that, to really try to look at how can we use and how can we adapt technology. I guess with the AI thing, for me, it feels, I think my most honest answer is I don't know. I can see potentially there being problems, and certainly can see how some people that I know have found or cultivated a relationship with, say, ChatGPT, in which on one level it is quite lovely. They see it as a friend. They have it as a supportive other that is validating and caring and encouraging. But I guess, again, because it's built upon algorithms, how much is it able to challenge? How much is it to really have the flexibility of empathy to not just do the more validating, positive, supportive bits, and to have more flexibility as a therapist, in the sense of we don't just validate, give positive affirmations, saying, oh, you're, well done, you did brilliant. We don't just do that, that actually we have this broad range of things that we try to bring for our clients depending on what's needed. And is it possible for AI to get to a stage where it's able to do those things? Probably in the future it will be able to, but how much do people use that version? Well, if it's a self-choice, maybe they do, but maybe they don't. Maybe they just want to stay with the positive affirmations, the encouraging other. So I can see on one level there's potentially helpfulness there, but I think I'm ambivalent at the moment about how far the tech could develop. One thing that does interest me, though, with this, and I think with technology, and it links to shame, actually, as you know, there is a big concern within the therapeutic community about us being replaced by AI, and it's completely understandable. I mean, the idea that we might not have jobs in the future, and given how much this is our identity and obviously paying our bills, but of course we care about this, we're bothered about this, of course is a threat, and it is a bit scary, and it's very easy to, I think, downplay and denigrate AI. And again, I do think there's a legitimacy to concerns about it, but the bit that I just wanted to touch on, which I think is really fascinating, is if I'm a client and I come to see you as my therapist, and let's say that I'm full of shame. I could be full of shame about my body. I could be full of shame about fantasies or things that go on inside my head. I could be full of shame about things that have happened to me in the past. We know that shame, the English word shame, comes from a very ancient word which means to hide or conceal. So if I feel ashamed of myself, I have this very powerful ancient emotion which is basically wanting me to conceal, to hide away. But what's therapy asking us to do?
Open up.
To share, to open up, to reveal. And so you have a classic conflict here in which you have this ancient emotion which is pulling you to try to hide and conceal in some way. You have a process which is therapy, which is built upon the predication of we need to be open and sharing. And of course, we try to leverage the therapeutic relationship and safeness to be able to do that. But you do have a bit of a tug of war there. And we do know, of course, that many of the clients who come to see us won't actually tell us the actual stuff. I mean, they'll tell us bits.
Yeah. Or tell us in later sessions.
Exactly. Final session. Oh, Merope, there's just this thing, actually. Thank you so much for helping me. But I know we've only got 5 minutes left, but I just wanted to say that maybe I should have told you before, but, when I was 6 years old, my stepfather said, and it's that last minute bit. Now, going back to AI, why I'm quite interested in this is, could people actually feel more able to open up to an AI-inspired therapist because they don't have the barrier of shame? Could they actually feel that this is more helpful because instead of me thinking, what's Merope going to think about me if I reveal this thing about my sexual fantasies or about my past or about my body, actually I don't have that same barrier with this AI relationship that I've got because I don't see it as human, and I don't have to work on those same principles that shame starts to create, in which I have this sense of external shame in which you will think lesser of me. You might reject me. You might think there's something bad or wrong with me. And then this sort of internal shame, I am bad, and I have to conceal, and I shouldn't tell my therapist. So I'm really intrigued by that. I'd love to do a research study in the future, looking at how high levels of shame might influence the potential helpfulness of an AI therapy relationship versus a real human therapy relationship.
Yeah. I'm asking about AI because it is something that a lot of people lately I'm hearing are more confident or feel more comfortable using.
Yes.
Either instead of going to therapy or before
Yes.
going to therapy. And also, I was thinking we did some research and university students looking into the fear of not being with your mobile,
Yes.
not having your mobile, and how it is correlated with social anxiety or being shameful, doing something and feeling shameful in social context. So I'm thinking it's not a specific research related to compassion, but now you mention it, I'm wondering, could we also look into that, how this is actually related to this feeling of shame and how we could actually manage that and get people to actually seek help more easily?
Yeah, I'm agnostic in the sense that the data will show us in the end, but I'm very open-minded to it. The thing that I appreciate about a lot of these things, whether it's our self-compassion app or some of the AI-inspired side of things, is that anything that allows more people to receive good quality help is a good thing in my book. And as you know, there are so many people that we're never, ever going to be able to work with who will never come to the therapy room. They can't afford it, or they don't know how to seek it, or they feel ashamed about it, or they think that therapy, whatever it is, will block people from actually coming to see you or seeing me or seeing some of our audience here. And so whatever else might be able to come online that could increase people's access to psychological help in one way or another, as long as it's good psychological help, I'm very open to that. And honestly, in the end, if it meant that there were fewer therapists and that there was less psychological suffering because people were able to use technology in this helpful way, on one level, I'd be okay with that. I guess my bigger concern ultimately is, are we using technology to try to help us with the distress that technology causes? Or are we using technology to try to help us with the fact that society and the way that society is moving is deleterious to our well-being and our psychological well-being in the first place, and that in a way we're looking at the wrong level of change? It's a bit like, I don't know, say in a river that you're trying to take away some of the toxins and the pollution in a part of the river. I mean, okay, that's good in some ways because the fish and the environment around that part of the river gets better. But actually the problem is 2 miles upstream where there's a big power plant that's pumping out the toxins in the first place. That's the place that we should be at. And so my concern in the end is that we're all getting distracted and focusing downstream, where actually what we need is to move upstream and to really think about what are some of the common modern causes of psychological distress, and can we start bringing change to those things, which of course is very difficult to do in terms of our influence and our capacity, our ability to bring change to that. And it can feel overwhelming for us. And, so we end up not collectively trying to do that. But I think from the compassion community, we are a biopsychosocial approach and the social aspect, and thinking about how can we look at systems, environments, organizations, systems of governance, all of these types of things is a big part of CFT as well. And lots of colleagues who are trying to bring change on that larger scale. And I have a huge amount of respect for them because I think there's a lot of wisdom in trying to do that.
So to sum up, going back to the source, like you said, and really looking into what meaningful changes we can make there, I think that would be an important step, right? And if AI can help us with that, we'll have to see.
Exactly.
But any help would be appreciated in alleviating distress. But like you said, research will tell us.
Ultimately, we've got to be research and science based on this.
True. So I wanted to go back to a comment that you said about the physiological aspects of compassion. And one of the ideas of CFT is cultivating the compassionate mind and connecting that mind to the body. And one of my personal favorite ideas is this body-mind connection, because it really makes sense to me, but also when I'm thinking about my clients as well. And my question here is how, I think it's a big question to ask, but maybe in a few words, how can one start to cultivate this compassionate mind? This is the first question. And then my other question is, how can we start to connect with our body more in a more compassionate way?
I guess briefly, the how partly is maybe we need to ask why. So first of all, if you're going to do this, if you're going to get fit, some people need to know why. Like, why am I going to spend time getting out of breath and my muscles hurting and taking all this time and paying money to a gym? Like, why is that important? So sometimes a starting point is, we need some of the psychoeducation of CFT to understand why compassion is important. And for that bit, we have to understand a little bit about how it is and why it is that we suffer. So this can be some of the psychoeducation, that we have this tricky brain that it's not our fault, but can get caught up in loops, that we've evolved a threat system that, again, has been bestowed to us. We didn't choose to have it, but comes preloaded with certain types of emotions like anger and shame and grief and so on, which can cause us a huge amount of pain. So it's this sort of idea of, first of all, understanding the sort of the why and the how, on that level. It's not my fault. It's not your fault. We didn't choose these things, but we do have a choice. And then the choice is a bit like, once you realize about, that we've got this body, we didn't choose it, but that if we don't do certain things with it, that we can actually become quite unhealthy, then we have a choice. What are we willing to do to change our diet, to change whether we smoke or not, to change how much exercise we do, to change, a whole bunch of different things. We have a choice. And I guess for us in CFT, it's really important then that people can sort of see the bridge, so before we do compassion practices, or to even think about stimulating the compassionate mind and body, why is this worthwhile? What is it about this? So I think the psychoeducation is useful. I think being able to have an understanding of some of the research to show that when you do practice compassion, that this is associated with significant reductions in psychological distress, that it's linked to significant increases in psychological well-being, that it brings changes to things like, a concern about compassion, as we said before, is that, I'll become lazy, I'll make more mistakes, I'll be less bothered and motivated. Actually, the research on compassion shows it's the opposite, that when people practice compassion, or they have higher levels of, say, self-compassion, they're more likely to study for a difficult test after experiencing a failure, that they're more likely to take care of their health, they're more likely to see their doctor. So there's something actually about self-compassion and compassion more broadly, which, rather than it being the fears and those concerns, that actually it does the opposite. It allows you to move towards things that are difficult, that might be distressing, that allows you to be in the presence of this. So I think those sort of studies can be quite useful sometimes to let people know that, don't have to believe me, have a look at some of these things here. This is like quite important stuff. And then, of course, we can think about the how. And that's a little bit like, okay, so I understand, you showed me now that, unfortunately, the way I'm living my lifestyle at the moment isn't very healthy, and it's causing X, Y, and Z damage to my body. So maybe you've been able to show me, Maropi, that my blood pressure is high, or that my blood sugars are off, or whatever it is, I'm overweight. Okay, so I get that bit. And then you've been able to show me that if I do exercise in this way, this is what tends to happen to people, reduction in blood pressure, reduction in this, great. So you've set out the scene. How? Like, okay, I know doing exercise, but which exercise, and how do I do it? And what happens if I have a bad back? How do I adjust it? So this bit then, in which you're like the personal trainer down at the gym, helping me to engage in and know how to lift weights properly without hurting my back, to help me, to guide me to how fast I should be running on the treadmill that is useful for my body, for how it is at the moment, That's then the bit about the compassionate mind training. We have a set of exercises, body and mind exercises, I guess, that have been shown scientifically to stimulate the physiology and the psychology, both of a part of our nervous system, I guess the parasympathetic branch of your nervous system, which has been shown to be very helpful in being able to partly regulate and balance out this more threat-based sympathetic nervous system, but also, of course, cultivating your mind and body in and for compassion. So it's we can begin to take people through these exercises. And I guess in a way, the gym analogy holds up. You know, you as my personal trainer could take me to the gym and you could start me off by doing some walking on the treadmill. And that helps maybe my cardiovascular system more broadly. Then you might take me to a machine that helps to do leg muscles and that targets specific clusters of muscles. Still good for my overall cardiovascular and bodily health, but it specifically targets muscles. And then you could take me to another machine that might work on biceps or shoulders. I guess we would take people through things like attention training, a variety of types of mindfulness practices, body posture work, facial expression and voice tone work, exercises that are designed to stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system, so changing your breathing rhythm, using imagery to stimulate the sense of your soothing system and its physiology, and then specific exercises in and around compassion that directly start to target, in a way, that compassion muscle and to build it up. So very much like the gym in that sense, that we can take you through a variety, and all of them in a way are psychologically positive, potentially, just like all machines down at the gym are all potentially good for your cardiovascular system. But it's the then specific targeting of certain types of exercises, I guess, that we would want to do. And that's the process then that we would try to support people in. And if people hit upon a problem, they struggle with a compassion practice or they struggle with mindfulness, of course, my job, just like your job as my personal trainer, is to adjust how I'm lifting a weight or to change how many reps I'm doing or how heavy the weight is. I'm there externally to try to support you so that when you do hit upon a difficulty with doing, say, the compassionate self-practice, I've got some ways in which I can validate you, help you to understand why that's the case, and I can adjust your posture, so to speak, to be able to try it in a slightly different way so that you can benefit from it.
I really find helpful the analogy, because we as therapists, we take this place of the trainer and going along and helping them in the beginning, perhaps more.
Yes.
And then slowly taking a step back and just, I have my eye on you. If you need me, I'm there. But
exactly. I can reach out to you.
Down.
But also your point from earlier, which was a really important one, is, and that also means then that the personal trainer doesn't just do the same thing with every single one of their clients who comes into the gym. They'll ask them first, have you experienced, what exercise have you done in the past? Do you have any pain? Do you have this thing? So they'll start to mold the practices dependent upon the person in front of them. So when you were saying earlier about the importance that we can be more process orientated, that we can sort of see the individual and begin to work with them. So they're not just going through exactly the same things in exactly the same order, that actually we can begin to have a nuanced way in how I can support you in how you start to engage in that. I think that is the trickiest thing, but also the wisdom, of course, as a therapist, how to help, particularly when you're working with people who have live very traumatized lives, that they find mindfulness and compassion physiologically stressful at first, or they find it quite scary to do for very, very understandable reasons. We're there in a way to metaphorically hold the person's hand, to be able to guide them, to help them to understand it's okay, that we're there with them, they're not on their own, and that we've seen it before, and that we've got ideas to help people, and that we can sometimes slow it down, or sometimes we can shift it a little bit. And so I think, that's the real wisdom in the end of therapies that include these types of practices, that we're not just doing them as okay, now we do this and now we do this. No. We're really monitoring the person and really getting accurate feedback and really thinking about what version does this person need and how can I help them?
Yeah. And I'm wondering, through this research that you've done on compassionate mind training and CFT, have you by now seen, if there are specific parts, let's say, active ingredients of this training or of the therapy itself that can be more beneficial to people or to some people than others? Or is it?
It's a great question. I guess we're moving in that way, but in terms of just the practices, so CFT as a whole, as a type of psychotherapy, at the moment seems to have a very wide reach, which is great in the sense that, we've got nice studies showing that CFT seems to be as helpful as CBT for working with people with inpatients with eating disorders. And in fact, that in a big trial in Norway, CFT was more effective for people with eating disorders who had a trauma background than CBT was. So again, I don't mean it's about trying to be better than other therapies, but being able to show that, okay, so with the eating disorder side, that seems to be quite helpful. That we've got my friend and colleague, Charlie Harriet-Maitland, who's doing wonderful work with CFT with psychosis. Kate Lucas doing great stuff with people with a diagnosis of borderline personality or personality disorders. You've got Deborah Lee, who's doing amazing work with PTSD. So you've got amazing colleagues who are doing work in the forensic population, showing changes in young people who have psychopathic traits and seeing a significant reduction in psychopathic traits when they go through CFT. So this idea then that we can have this very wide reach, I guess the next bit is really trying to understand more and more about, well, who is benefiting, and is there certain parts of CFT that seems to land best? And that kind of detailed research, that sort of almost component analysis bit, I think we're moving towards at this stage. What I would say is, I don't know. My gut feel would be that there will be tendencies for certain things being more helpful on a process level for certain people. But again, I would say that that's where maybe a next phase of research will start looking more and more, and to begin to see that, actually with this type of thing here, that maybe going into using certain types of practices could be helpful. For example, we're just doing a study at the moment. There are two major compassion practices in CFT. The compassionate other, in which you create an image of a compassionate figure and it directs compassion to you. And then the compassionate self, so you imagine you as someone with the qualities of compassion. So these sort of two major practices. Roughly speaking, I don't know, like 50-50, whether one person prefers one of these practices to another. I mean, sometimes people are fine with both. Sometimes they find both very difficult. But if I were to take 1,000 people, like in the general population, through this exercise, probably 400 might put their hands up saying they prefer the compassionate self, 600 would say the compassionate other, or something similar. So in my experience of training tens of thousands of people across the world, I tend to find this. Now, from my side of things, I'm really intrigued. Like, can we begin to see, is there some reason why people might find? So one study that we're just working on at the moment is to look at attachment style. So if you have an anxious attachment style, for example, in which through no fault of your own, you've had to become more orientated to observing and vigilant to the minds of others. Are they there? Are you there for me? Do you care for me? Do you love me? This real want, in a way, to know that there's somebody who will be present, but also struggling in a way to allow and to trust that that's the case. We imagine that then, if I'm struggling in that way, which of these two practices would I find easier? For example, you could imagine that maybe it would be the compassionate other, because this image of the compassionate other is this figure that is wise, strong, and committed to you, that will always be there when you need them, that has the qualities for you to help you to feel safe, to feel cared for. You could imagine in some ways, maybe if you have a more anxious attachment style, maybe that's a bit easier because that's what you really ultimately would like. Or maybe it's more difficult because it is in that dynamic and that flow that is triggering your threat system. In comparison, if you take more on the avoidant side of the attachment styles bit, in which you've had to learn that you can't really rely on others, that in some ways you have to keep a type of physical and sometimes emotional distance, and that you have to maybe down-regulate your own emotions and maybe try to rely on yourself more. I could maybe imagine that doing the compassionate other would be exactly the hardest thing for you, because actually that's the type of thing in which you've learnt not to look out to, not to open up to, because your attachment system has had to learn that that's not okay, it's dangerous. Or maybe the other way around, you could think, but that's maybe exactly what people need if they have a more avoidant attachment style. So This type of research, I'm kind of involved in some of it. I know other people are as well, in which we can begin to cross over what we were talking about earlier, the sort of process, let's just say here, the attachment system, and then start to think about, with these different types of exercises, what's going to be most helpful for people, and how can we then adapt things to meet the needs of different processes and different types of non-symptom based presentations.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating, I think, and I'm really looking forward to the results.
Yeah, me too as well. I'll let you know when I find out.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So, for anyone, as we close this discussion, I could sit here for hours talking to you, but
Me too.
I'll slowly wrapping this up. For anyone listening to our discussion who still, is starting to think about compassion and CFT and how this could be helpful, but is still a bit hesitant. What would you say to them?
I'd say it's completely understandable. You're not on your own. You're actually many other people who have similar queries and concerns, and that's absolutely okay. Second thing I would say is feel free to drop me an email. I'm very happy to be in contact and to try to send some information, send some ideas, maybe even answer some questions if that's helpful, or at least guide you to material that could be useful in helping you answer some of those questions. And that ultimately, in the end, I guess the bit here is that we're hoping, or I'd be encouraging people, that although your fears are very understandable and your concerns about this might be very legitimate, that once people do start engaging in the process, once they do start learning a bit about CFT and beginning to get into the practices, that actually seeing the potential and the powerful change, that it is worth taking that courageous first step. And in fact, we would legitimize this in saying that actually, when it comes to developing the compassionate mind, we talk about it's almost like they're 3 pillars of the compassionate mind or the compassion itself. So one is wisdom. So wisdom is often talked about as the combination of knowledge plus experience. And I guess the wisdom bit here is that what would the wisest thing to do? If you've got some concerns, probably it's to find out more information, to ask questions, to check in with somebody who you might trust to give you some of these answers. So that would be one thing. So let's see if we can start to develop your wisdom and to learn more and to talk maybe about some of your concerns and your fears, and see if you can be open to being validated with that, but also seeing why maybe going down this path could be helpful. The other bit with wisdom, of course, is begin to look into and recognizing that whilst other people have those concerns, seeing actually the benefits, many, many different studies of cultivating self-compassion through CFT and other practices. So beginning to almost see that, though it doesn't fit the easiest for me, I'm a bit concerned, actually I can see here, there's quite a lot of data here showing that it is helpful for people. So maybe that's a wise thing to hold in mind. Second thing, in terms of these 3 pillars, the second one is strength and courage. That actually we often talk with compassion, a bit like the firefighter example earlier, that often compassion does require courage, groundedness and strength. And that although it's really understandable that you might be feeling anxious here, that asking some more questions, reaching out to me or doing some more reading is actually an act of courage. That actually is a courageous action, because actually, if it was just your anxiety talking, it would want you to stay away from this probably. If it's just your skepticism and your fears, then you're probably going to move away from it. So actually, it is a compassionate action, a courageous action to stay with and alongside your fears and your anxieties, and to lean in and to ask questions and to seek some further resources on this. And then the third sort of pillar of compassion is care and commitment. And this bit is really important in a way. If this was your child, if this was your best friend, if this was your partner, if this was your parents, what would you want for them? What would be your compassionate orientation? Like, what would you want for them to be able to do and to be able to seek out? And then beginning to see if you can hold that same thing for you, that you are as worthy and that your pain and your distress is legitimate, and that can we start this process of you noticing your own distress and beginning to develop a caring commitment towards it. And that doesn't mean that you have to start by jumping straight into the pool at the deep end and going straight into compassion-focused therapy. But there are a lot of stepping stones before that. You know, we tend not to teach kids how to swim in the deep end of the pool for a reason, and that actually if therapy and compassion-focused therapy feels like it's too much like the deep end of the pool, or even actually into the depths of the ocean with big waves, that's okay. Maybe there's a wisdom here to recognize that feels like it's too much. But actually there are some nice stepping stones before that, more shallow end of the pool bit. So maybe one of the self-help books you mentioned at the start of the talk and the conversation that we had, so that maybe the Compassionate Mind workbook would be a good starting point in which you can just start to read and understand a bit more and begin to apply some of these ideas inwards. Or maybe, of course, I'm biased, the self-compassion app. So maybe, again, I've just got this on my phone and I can just start taking a few sessions, seeing how it is, acclimatizing myself to it, and just beginning to see that actually it's a starting point. And then if that feels okay and you begin to get on okay with that, okay, maybe you can complete the whole course, or maybe you could reach out to somebody to seek compassion-focused therapy. So I think there are lots of different stages. But again, as long as you hold the wisdom, so courageous aspects, and then this caring commitment, this willingness, even if it's just to take a small step, that is a compassionate action.
And so if you're still here listening and being with us, for the listeners, they have already taken this first,
yes,
or even not the first steps, but they've taken important steps towards reaching their compassion towards others and themselves. So I feel that for me, as well as for whoever's listening, this talk has been really helpful. So thank you for this really rich and enlightening, I might say, discussion. We touched several bits, important aspects of compassion, self-compassion, the research base of it, and the benefits of compassion and cultivating the compassionate mind. And yeah, I think there are still so many exciting things that are coming up from research and new topics that are now being looked into. So I think we're all looking forward to those next steps of CFT and compassion, and what new, or what not so new, but more established and hard evidence there is, although it is a very well researched area.
Yes.
So thank you so much for this discussion, and thank you so much also for being the first speaker in our series, and starting this series with such important topic as compassion.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone for watching, and I'd be very happy to come on as a future guest to update you on some of those research projects, and I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other things we could talk about as well, but thank you so much.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Chris.